Alrighty everyone, so we're going to get into part 2 of the last YouTube video I made, which was going over my client Emma's meet prep for her first competition. Now this is part 2 because I said in there I would follow up with the meet prep for this competition, which was Massachusetts States, and she did great. She went 9 for 9. We got a 15 kilo meet PR, and we had an all-time PR on the squat, so we PR'd the squat by 5 pounds. First 225-pound squat, really big milestone there. Bench press was 148 pounds. That was a 3-pound all-time PR. Both of those, squat and bench, those were PRs off of what she hit 1 week out. And then the deadlift, we tied her all-time PR, which she also hit a week out. From the first meet to the second meet, it was 10 pounds on the squat, 10 pounds roughly, 11 pounds on the bench, and then 10 pounds on the deadlift. So overall, very good performance. Definitely better. The first one was good, but this definitely was topped it. So that was how it went. And the flow of this video, it's going to roughly be going into what our goals were for this prep, what we did / why we did it. I'm going to kind of integrate both of those. So we'll look at the program, how this program might differ from the last one, like the last meet prep, and then kind of integrating why we're doing different things and why we're doing similar things. And then we'll also just get into a little bit of technique stuff too. So starting with what our goals were. So our goals this meet was to at least match what we did at the last one. Now, realistically, I thought we probably could have did a little bit more because she's a newer lifter. When we're newer, we generally can just make more progress at a faster rate. So I had a feeling she was going to be able to do more here just because it was her second competition and, most of those first meet nerves are gone. Things just tend to go a little bit better, especially because, she's not even been powerlifting for a year. But just to play it safe for setting expectations, let's at least match because we know what we've done at 1. Let's at least match that. Try to squeeze out a little bit extra if we can. And then with technique, this was like the second goal, just locking out her knees more on the deadlift because we did get a red light for that. It counted, but it was something to keep in mind. She just wasn't locking out her knees enough. So we made some adjustments to the setup and also with some mobility changes with some exercises, which that'll be kind of last when we get into that. But those were our main 2 goals. Lock out our deadlifts, and let's try to do a little bit better if we can compared to the last meet. But let's at least match it. We did better anyways, so that was great. Now, we can get into the programming side of things. All right, so before I get really into the details of the programming, we're going to start zoomed out. And we're going to look at this stimulus recovery adaptation curve, SRA curve. This pretty much explains like how we get stronger for the most part. So what it means is we have a training stimulus. So we work out at a sufficient intensity, pretty hard, and then that creates fatigue. Fatigue can be a couple different things, but it creates fatigue. We recover from that fatigue. This dotted line represents our baseline strengths, like where our strength's currently at before this training stimulus. And after we recover, the idea is that we are able to go above our baseline strength. That's the adaptation. That's the part where we have actually gotten stronger now. So when you're able to add weight from 1 week to the next, it's because you had a sufficient training stimulus, you incurred fatigue, you're recovered from that, you adapted, now you can add more weight. And then there's a peak right here. So you'll often hear we're peaking for a competition. We're literally trying to reach a new height, a new peak on this curve. And then what you'll notice is after we get that new adaptation and we're stronger than we normally are, it drops off and we start to detrain. So essentially what it feels like, it's like I feel recovered, but I don't feel strong. That's like what that detraining feeling feels like. And the reason that happens after a competition, let's say, it's because we taper. So when we taper, we're taking stuff out, whether it's volume, whether it's accessories certainly count for total stress on your body if we look at it really general. If we pull 70% of, like if we look at a program, like 70 to 80% of that is accessories, I mean, depending on the program. So if we pull 70 to 80% of your program out, that's going to detrain you because that's like most of your program. And then that's why we get this drop off. And eventually it can dip below this baseline and we start feeling weaker than we actually are, even though we're not fatigued yet. So this explains pretty much everything in a very general lens. So we're going to look at this to kind of piece together why we made certain decisions with this prep compared to the last one. So with what I just said at this last part here, at the end of a competition, you're like here, you're detrained because we just pulled out a good amount of accessories, pulled some weight off the par, pulled some volume down. So if I have to do another meet 7 weeks later, and I'm expecting to at least match this, if not do better, I need to create a strong enough training stimulus to get me out of this dip. Now, initially, it is going to dip down, but we need that dip to be coming from hard training, so it's coming from fatigue, versus it coming from not training enough. So that's where increasing volume after a meet can be helpful. So that could be through sets, reps, or sets, reps times weight, kind of all added up as tonnage, but mainly looking at sets and reps. Could even throw accessory work in there as well to create a strong enough training stimulus so that we're actually creating fatigue. Because if we create fatigue, now we have something we need to recover from. Now this is all within reason, right? I'm not saying you have to do like 30 extra sets, but even just a couple extra sets, a couple extra reps, that can go a really long way. So we create fatigue, now we recover from it, and then the idea is by the time we get on the other side of 7 weeks, we're a little bit stronger than we were at the last meet. So at the beginning of this 7-week block, I raised her volume past what it normally was. So we knew she could recover from a certain amount of, I usually look at total reps performed. So we knew she could recover from a certain amount of total reps. That's kind of where she flourished. That's where she felt her strongest. I initially pushed it past that to get us out of this detraining feeling and actually intentionally create fatigue. Because I know if I create fatigue and then I recover, I should be able to end up here. So now we can see what like all this conceptual stuff actually looks like. So this is the states, so the most recent prep program. So what we'll see if we really look at this guy here, weekly volume. So we can see that she does 47 reps of bench in this first week, 20 reps of squat, 17 reps of deadlift. This is past what she normally recovers well from to feel strong. So big difference there between feeling strong and getting stronger. Now, for most people, there's probably going to be a need of not feeling as strong temporarily so that we can get stronger. And a lot of times that can come from just pushing the volume up a little bit more or just trying harder as well with like maybe accessories or something like that too. Can go either way. But volume is definitely the more potent variable to adjust in this case, especially coming off a competition. We need something that's going to work, hopefully. We pulled this lever instead. There's also some other reasons I'm going to get to in a minute or two, but volume was higher. And then we can see as the block went on, it went down, and it got down to where her normal recoverable volume is, which is 40, 15, and 11 total reps. So as it goes down, you can see it gets back to where she feels her strongest. And coincidentally, this is the closest to the meet. So as we get closer to the meet, we want you to start to feel stronger because that's the time for that, right? That's the end goal. But further away from the meet, we need to spend some time building some strength. And that's where I get into this little pyramid analogy that I like, which is to, I guess, build that strength. And I talked about this in the last video, but to build that strength, there's certain qualities that we need that we can actually reach a new height with and feel strong and lift more weight. And some qualities at this bottom of this pyramid are going to include work capacity, which is just like how much you can actually recover from, hypertrophy, or just like how big your muscles are, neuromuscular efficiency, which is how efficient you can produce force, essentially, so you can move weight faster, I guess, or accelerate it, move it quicker, and do it more efficiently. And then mobility and skill are also kind of included in there as well. Skill being like technique, how well you do that stuff. That is down here. So if that stuff isn't being trained, if it's not being dosed appropriately through my program, this bottom base of my pyramid can start to detrain, like that curve that I showed earlier. So we can imagine if the base of the pyramid shrinks, my peak also shrinks. So peak, this kind of represents like our max strength, so like our 1 rep max. So if I don't train this stuff like ever, let's say, and let's say I just did singles versus like just doing sets of 5 or something like that. If I were to just do singles all the time and nothing else, this base is going to just get very small, and my ability to lift more weight is going to go down. So we need both. And that's where the increasing the volume side of things comes into play for her. So that's why we did what we did with the volume. So we increased the total reps past which you can normally recover with. And then we also kind of changed some stuff with the average intensity of the sets that are like 3 or more reps, roughly. So basically the things that was like sets of 4 to 5, we just made them harder, and we tried to push those sets a little bit more than we normally would. So starting off with sets of 5 here, pushing some top sets of 4, back off sets of 5, pushing a triple, a set of 4, and then back down sets of 5, trying to make that stuff harder, because that's going to be a stronger stimulus than just like singles right off the bat coming off of a prep. But then as the block goes on, how hard those sets start to go down, and the weight on the bar starts to go up, and the reps on the top set go down. So we get closer to like doing singles with stuff close to our 1 rep max. And then we start making these sets of 4 and 5, at least this is what I did with her. We start making those more like back offset stuff. So you'll see in this first week, it was literally just a 4x5. And we ascended here, so we went up in weight each set, but a 4x5 up to 81% of her 1 rep max. And then, or at least her estimated 1 rep max of like her training on average, so a training max. And then now we get to a week like this, and you can see that those sets of 4 and 5 are not going up to 81%. It's like 60 to 67%. But most of that high percentage work now, it's coming from the heavy stuff, the singles, because we're getting closer to the competition. That's where we want most of that to be at. So we pull the weight down on those higher rep stuffs closer to competition generally, and then we increase the weight on the stuff that's a little bit heavier, lower rep singles, because that's the end goal anyways. And the other thing that we kind of look at too is fatigue. How is this changing the fatigue being distributed? So if we reference this curve again, in order for me to get an adaptation, I need a training stimulus that creates fatigue that I have to recover from. With fatigue, I mentioned earlier that there's a couple different types of fatigue. So main types are going to be peripheral fatigue and central fatigue. Peripheral fatigue is kind of like muscular fatigue, like muscular soreness, things like that we can feel a lot more directly. Like, oh, my back's a lot more sore than normal. Or I just did, like if you did 10 sets of squatting, 10 sets of 10 for some reason, your legs and low back are probably going to feel very beat up, right? Versus if you do maybe 10 sets of 1, that's not going to feel the same, right? You might not feel your quads necessarily on fire after 10 sets of 1, but if they were all pretty hard, your body in general is going to feel smoked. That's more of that central nervous system fatigue. So the central nervous system encompasses like our brain and spinal cord, and that type of fatigue is created from when we lift heavier stuff in general. And then with peripheral fatigue, that comes more from higher rep, higher volume stuff. And both types of fatigue increase if the RPE, or the rate of perceived exertion, increase, so the sets are just harder. So we can intentionally change what type of fatigue we're getting to change the type of adaptation we're getting here. So at the beginning of her training cycle, we focused more on generating a work capacity and skill type of adaptation, and probably some muscular building stuff as well, so that we can make that broad base of our pyramid. And we did that by, like I said, increasing the average intensity of those like moderate to higher rep sets, just making those things a little bit harder, because that's going to generate more of that peripheral fatigue. And that's going to still get us an adaptation a little bit differently. I threw skill in there because we're doing more reps. We're literally just practicing the lift more. We're going to get some skill benefits out of that, even if we don't see it right away. But as we increase the load on the bar and we pull the volume down, even though the RPE might go up, we're changing the type of fatigue. So we're changing the training stimulus and we're changing the fatigue we're getting. So now the training stimulus is, let's say, 2 to 3 singles, but they're like at 9 to 10 RPE. What we're doing there is we're generating a lot of central fatigue versus peripheral fatigue. And central fatigue is a lot more general. Like I said, like you might not feel it directly. You might feel generally kind of tired. Maybe your mood's in a disarray. Excuse me. Maybe your appetite's thrown off, sleep's not good. It's more of a general kind of worn down, groggy feeling. And then that yields a different adaptation. That's more of a neuromuscular adaptation. And neuromuscular is the connection between our brain and our muscles. So if I get good at lifting heavy stuff by moving more weight or moving that weight quicker, I'm going to be able to produce more force. I'm going to be able to lift, when I say quicker, I really mean with more intention. I'm going to be able to produce more force. I'm going to be able to lift more weight, and then I'm going to be able to do it efficiently over time. So it's a different adaptation. So beginning of the training cycle, more peripheral fatigue, more work capacity, volume focus adaptations here. And then end of the training block, the 7-week block, we generated more central fatigue and we got more neuromuscular, more 1 rep max specific adaptations here. And they both led to different things. So with the program here, I kind of have a general summary of all that at the bottom right here. So week 1 versus week 6. So week 1, peak intensity, moderate. Average intensity of those higher moderate rep sets, high. Volume, high. Central fatigue, moderate. I say moderate because it was like a set of 5. It wasn't a set of 10. Peripheral fatigue, higher. Back offsets, less. I can get to that in a second. And then in week 6, it's like the exact opposite, pretty much. Now, the last thing was like the set structure. So when I say less back offsets in week 1, it's because we were literally doing like straight sets. So same weight, same reps, or ascending sets where we build up. So we're not backing off ever. We're either building up or like keeping it the same. Or maybe we're just doing, like for the squat, for example, we had 2 top sets and then 2 back off sets. So this is kind of like a straight set because the range was the same. So 2 top sets of 4, 140 to 150, really trying to get good at sets of 4 here. But we just got 2 back off sets. But then if we get to the final week, we have 2 singles that are pretty heavy, but then we have 3 back off sets. So more back off sets means if I do like a set of 4, let's say, if I do that after a top set, it's probably not going to be as good, as productive for a training stimulus compared to if I did it first. So if I'm doing that stuff last now, I'm not getting as strong. I'm probably not getting as strong of a work capacity focused training stimulus, at least for her in this case, because she does really well when like a set of 4 or 5. When that comes first, it's just going to move better for her. And a lot of that has to do with like range of motion and stuff like that. But essentially less back offsets at the beginning, more at the end. That also allows us to drive up the weight on the bar a lot more on these top sets, these top singles in this case. So that's like a general overview of how we made the block go along those 7 weeks and how it can all be explained by this SRA curve. We can change the stimulus, that changes the fatigue, that changes the adaptation. And we had to do it, we didn't have to necessarily, but I basically changed stuff each week so that we could speed up the rate that could happen and allow us to get out of this detraining feeling. So that is pretty much all the programming for the new block. Now we can kind of just like compare a little bit with the previous one. All right, so with the previous one, when we were 5 weeks out, so week 1, we were already doing a single. Let's look at the deadlift. A single, top set of 2, or a paused set of 2, and then 2 sets of 4. So this was 5 weeks out. If we go to 5 weeks out here, we were not doing that. We were going, so that's like what, week 2, week 3, roughly, somewhere around here. We were doing a top triple, double, 2 sets of 5. So why that's different is what I was just saying. Because we just did a competition before this, we're detrained to the volume element of things. So we got to ramp that back up in these first few weeks. And we can save the singles for a little bit later, especially with her deadlift. We can do them, we don't have to do them as often. With something like her bench press, though, I wanted that to get heavier the soonest because that seemed to need it the most soon. So you can see that we were already doing a double top set of 2 just in the 3rd week back in. And that's just because that's what that lift needed for her. So, so like I was saying, that was the main difference between like the deadlift week 1 versus the same time frame week 1 and this one. But the last like 3 weeks, when it comes to the actual tapering process, or I guess like 2 weeks really, it looks pretty much identical. So we can see with the Mass States one, we got a single, a set of 2, set of 4, pretty hard single, and then 10% less from the week before. And then if we go to, so this would be pretty much 1 week out. If we go to 1 week out here, which look at that, it's the same exact thing. Same set and rep structure, same heavy single, minus 10% from the last week. So same sort of tapering strategy. That was the same because we knew that that was what worked. But leading up to that had to be different because the previous conditions changed. Before the first meet, we were spending time doing sets of 3, 4, 5, things like that, trying to get good at that base building, focusing a lot on the accessories, things like that. But the previous conditions for this second meet was a meet. So we didn't have all that time doing that, so we had to kind of make up for it in like 5 weeks, essentially. So we pretty much condensed like a whole macro cycle into 7 weeks, essentially. So that was like the main difference and similarities between these two blocks. Tapering strategy, same. Difference was the first like 3 to 5 weeks. Now, the final thing we can get into is technical change to the deadlift. So if we pull up the Mass States prep part. So we added 2 exercises. We added a wall-supported hip airplane and a low oblique lift-off. So what those look like are here. Just make sure this is muted. So wall-supported hip airplane looks something like this. So we're trying to keep this leg stable, and we're turning our body towards this leg, and that's stretching out that backside glute and like that back of that hip. And then the wall supported, or the low oblique liftoff looks like this. We're just holding this position. So our femurs are cranked out and we're on our forearm. It looks like a side plank, but my leg is pressing into the ground. And what this does, so when we look at something like locking out the knees in a deadlift, we have to accomplish 2 main things. The femur needs to internally rotate relative to a tibia that is externally rotated. So if I were to show that here on a kind of broken skeleton, when I straighten my knee, this has to turn out relative to this, so in relationship to this, and this has to kind of come in. So we might have a harder time to do that if the backside of the hip is closed off. Because if the backside of the hip is closed off and my pelvis is more externally rotated, my femurs might have a harder time internally rotating. So what we sought to do was improve the hip internal rotation at the hip, at the pelvis. So kind of open the back up here. And we could tell that she was having a hard time doing that because she did really well with things like hip thrusts, kickbacks, things that really shorten that space. But she really struggled with things that stretched out her glutes, like RDLs, and that's like the main one, RDLs. And she had a lot of low back rounding and a lot of knee bending. That's why we had a hard time locking out the knees. So starting off with something like a hip airplane allows her to stretch out that glute at the bottom because we're keeping this whole structure here, the whole leg, still, and we're rotating around that. So we're stretching out the back here, essentially. We're opening up space here. And then we are pushing out of that space on the way back up. So we're kind of moving the femur in different directions, and we're opening up space and closing off space here. And then we pair that with something like a side plank. So if we go to the side plank, what this exercise is doing, it's putting my femur in external rotation, but because it's a side plank, my forearm's on the ground, my obliques are contracting, right? And they do this. They internally rotate the pelvis because they're contracting and pulling kind of these two parts together and opening up the backside a little bit. So the obliques on the bottom side, they're internally rotating the pelvis while my femur is externally rotated. So relatively speaking, if my leg is out here, but my pelvis stays forward and internally rotated, I'm improving my hip internal rotation because my femur stays out while my pelvis stays like kind of facing forward. So this is opening up space in the back of the hip essentially because we're keeping the hips here, but we're moving the leg out here. And we're keeping the hips here by using the obliques, and we're moving the leg out here by pressing into the ground and getting that glute med to kind of help externally rotate the femur. And with those two exercises paired together, we saw a pretty immediate difference as far as the lockout goes, and just showing it with on the platform. So this was her first meet, and we can tell by video that she had a really hard time like doing this. It was mainly coming from the hips and the low back, a lot of low back rounding off the floor. But then when we got to lockout, she kind of had to pull everything back versus kind of standing straight up. And you can see that there. And you can see that the knees have a hard time locking out. Versus here, she has a much better time locking out the knees. And we can also kind of look at it. It's hard to tell, but we can also look at the foot to kind of cue in this. This is a little bit different because my tibia needs to externally rotate when I lock out my knee. That means my foot's relatively going to be more supinated. So if I were to think being on the outside edge of my foot, my tibia is probably a little bit more turned out and externally rotated. So if we look at her feet here, they're a little bit more caved in, more pronated, which is probably why it's harder to lock out her knees here. Versus here, you can actually kind of see that there's more pressure on the outside of her foot. So her tibias are a little bit more externally rotated. That femur is more internally rotated. Then the knee locks out better. So we can look at the foot too, and we can also see that the lockout's different. And then if we watch it, it's also just looks a little bit smoother in general. Still has some low back rounding off the floor. That's going to probably be there a little bit no matter what. But just looking at the lockout, much more smooth, and she's able to hold on to it. That's the most important part. And stand straight up because we're actually moving a little bit better through her hips in general. So that's kind of what we did technically. Those were the exercises that we picked. And just as a recap, we improved the knee mechanics by looking at the hip, looking up the chain, and seeing, can we open up space on the back there, or at least teach her how to get there. And then double down on that with an exercise like side plank with the leg out, pressing into the ground. And that helps to, I guess, double down on that, like I said. And she ended up moving a lot better. Now, the other thing that we also introduced to was slack pull, trying to get more slack out of the bar before she actually pulls. Now, we didn't have enough time to really work on this a whole lot, so we still have to work on it a little bit more, but essentially going from a static start position, so not pushing the hips up and then swinging them through, to moving them a little bit more, I think made her feel a little bit better. So if we look at it here, she has to pick her hips up and then kind of swing them in. Now we still got pitched forward a little bit, but overall made her feel a little bit stronger. And once we get more time with that, I think we'll get a better understanding of it. Versus here, it was just a static start off the ground, so it just made it 10 times harder for her in her hands right there. And it's pretty much like a stiff leg deadlift. Now, this puts us very much in front of the bar, so I'm past where I'm my most balanced. And because I'm so far in front of the bar now, I have to swing everything behind it to get this to lock out. So from a balance perspective too, improving the starting position, getting her armpits over the bar more at the start, helped us also lock out better as well, because we didn't have to swing back at lockout behind the bar. We were able to kind of just stand straight up. So better slack management, we can call it too, with introducing a little bit of a wedge. But that is about everything. I don't need this to be insanely long video, but we went over the last meet that Emma did, and I guess why that made us do what we did now. We went over the 7-week block that we ran, the programming behind it, the reason why, using that SRA curve to explain why we made the decisions we made. And then we also just went into technical stuff, how we use some mobility type exercises to drive a change and help her move a little bit better, lock at her knees, adhere to the rules. And yeah, that was pretty much it. So if you enjoyed this programming breakdown, technique breakdown kind of combo, let me know, and I can do more stuff like this with other people. But yeah, that's all I got.